Chapter 17 of Aircraft and Submarines by Willis J. Abbott. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by William Tomko. The Future of the Submarine, Part 1. The world will not always be at war. Interminable as the conflict by which it is now racked seems, and endless as appears the resources of the nations participating in it, the time must come when victory or sheer exhaustion shall compel peace. People talk of that peace being permanent. That is perhaps too sanguine a dream while human nature remains what it is, and nations can still be as covetous, ambitious, and heedless of others' rights as are individuals. But beyond doubt a prolonged period of peace awaits the world. What then is to be the future of the aircraft and the submarine which had to wait for war to secure any recognition from mankind of their prodigious possibilities? Of the future of the aircraft there can be no doubt. Its uses in peace will be innumerable. Poor old Count Zeppelin, who thought of his invention only as a weapon of war, nevertheless showed how it might be successfully adapted to the needs of peace merely as a by-product. As for the airplane, both for sport and business, its opportunities are endless. Easy and inexpensive to build, simple to operate with but little training on the part of the aviator, it will be made the common carrier of all nations. Already the United States is maintaining an aerial mail service in Alaska. Already, too, bi- and triplanes are built capable of carrying 25 to 30 men besides guns and ammunition. It is easy to foresee the use that can be made of machines of this character in times of peace. Needing no tracks or right-of-way, requiring no expensive signaling or operative system, asking only that at each end of the route there shall be a huge level field for rising and for landing, these machines will in time take to themselves the passenger business of the world. But the future of the submarine is more dubious. Always it will be a potent weapon of war. It may indeed force the relegation of dreadnoughts to the scrap heap, but of its peaceful services there is more doubt. That it can be made a cargo carrier is unquestionably true, but to what good? There is no intelligent reason for carrying cargoes slowly under water which might just as well be carried swiftly on the surface unless war compels concealment. Underwater navigation must always be slower and more expensive than surface navigation, nor does it seem probable that the underwater boats can ever equal in size ordinary ships, though undoubtedly their present proportions are going to be greatly increased. As a result of the German submarine campaign, it is possible that the United States may develop a fleet of underwater merchantmen to circumvent the enemy while this war continues, though there has been but little discussion of it. But, even so, common sense would indicate that such a fleet would be abandoned on the restoration of peace. If anything is to be done toward making the submarine a vessel of ordinary everyday use, the present double system of motors, the Diesels for surface navigation and the electric for submerged service, will have to be abandoned. Inventors, however, are diligently working on this problem today. Indeed, so well known and successful a builder of submarines as Mr. Simon Lake seemed to have faith in their possibilities as merchant craft. As early as February 1916 he announced that he had taken out a patent on a new form of cargo-carrying submarine which he described as made up of nests of light-weight circular tanks of comparatively small diameter surrounded by a ship-shaped form of hull. What advantage was to accrue from this type of vessel Mr. Lake has not explained. However, the Germans, who seemed to originate everything successfully, demonstrated that the merchant submarine was a practicable and useful craft with which to beat the blockade. This was proved by the two successful trips made by the unarmed German merchant submarine Deutschland between Germany and the United States in 1916. Loaded with a cargo of dyestuffs and chemicals, she left Bremen on June 14, 1916, and arrived in Baltimore early in July. After a short stay, during which she took on a full return cargo, consisting chiefly of rubber and metal, she started on August 1, 1916, for her return trip to Bremen, where she arrived safely soon after August 15, 1916. Once more, in October of the same year, she made a successful round trip, docking this time in New London. There was considerable talk about additional trips by other German merchant submarines, but none of them were ever carried out. It has never become known whether this was due to the loss of these merchant submarines or to political relations between Germany and the United States, which were then gradually assuming a less friendly form. Of course, it is true that such boats are blockade runners and in a way, therefore, part and parcel of warfare. But they are unarmed merchantmen just the same, and their exclusively mercantile character has been officially acknowledged by the United States government. Under conditions of peace, however, it is very doubtful whether submarine merchantmen would play, nor does it seem as if they possessed any advantages at all over surface merchant vessels. Nevertheless, they represent an entirely new development of submarine navigation, and therefore deserve attention. During her stay in the United States, very few people were permitted to get more than a glance of the Deutschland. As a result, comparatively little became known regarding her mechanical details. The Scientific American, however, in its issue of July 22, 1916, gives a fairly detailed description of this first merchant submarine. From this account we learn that the Deutschland conforms rather closely to the typical German naval U-boat. The hull proper consists of an internal cigar-shaped cylindrical structure, which extends from stem to stem, and in its largest diameter measures about 20 feet. Enclosing this hull is a lighter false hull which is perforated to permit the entrance and exit of the sea water and is so shaped as to give the submarine a fairly good ship model for driving at high speed on the surface and at a much lesser speed submerged. The upper portion of the false hull does not present such a flat deck-like appearance as is noticeable in the naval U-boats. In fact, the whole modelling of the Deutschland, as compared with the naval boats, suggests that she has been fulled out somewhat, with a view to obtaining the necessary displacement for cargo carrying. The interior cylindrical hull is divided by 4 transverse bulkheads into 5 separate watertight compartments. Compartment number 1, at the bow, contains the anchor cables and electric winches for handling the anchor, also general ship stores and a certain amount of cargo. Compartment number 2 is given up entirely to cargo. Compartment number 3, which is considerably larger than any of the others, contains the living quarters of the officers and crew. At the after end of this compartment, and communicating with it, is the conning tower. Compartment number 4 is given up entirely to cargo. Compartment number 5 contains the propelling machinery, consisting of 2 heavy oil engines and 2 electric motors. The storage batteries are carried in the bottom of the boat, below the living compartment. For purposes of communication, a gangway 2 feet 6 inches wide by 6 feet high is built through each cargo compartment, thus rendering it possible for the crew to pass entirely from one end of the boat to the other. The length of the Deutschland is about 315 feet, beam 30 feet, and draft 17 feet. For surface propulsion and for charging the batteries, the boat carries 2 4-cylinder diesel heavy oil motors of about 600 horsepower each. The speed at the surface is from 12 to 13 knots, and submerged it is 7 knots. At the surface the displacement of the boat is about 2,000 tons, and she has a cargo capacity of about 700 tons. The freeboard to the main deck, which runs the full length of the boat but is only about 5½ feet wide, is about 6 feet, and the cockpit at the top of the conning tower is about 15 feet above the water. This cockpit, by the way, is suggestive of the protection afforded a chauffeur in an automobile, there being a shield in front of the quartermaster, so shaped as to throw the wind and spray upwards and clear of his face. 2 periscopes are provided, one at the forward end of the conning tower, and the other, of larger diameter, being forward and on the starboard of the conning tower. An interesting feature of the 2 folding steel wireless masts, about 50 feet in height, both of which fold aft into the pockets built in the deck of the ship. The forward one of these masts carries a crow's nest for the lookout. The commander of the Deutschland, Captain Paul Koenig, was before the war a popular captain of North American Lloyd liners. He has published a very vivid and interesting account of the Deutschland's trip, The Voyage of the Deutschland. In this book he tells us how he was offered this novel command while the plans were still being drawn, and that he immediately accepted, making, however, the proviso if the thing really comes off. The men backing the venture lost no time, and, so Captain Koenig tells us, in less than 2 months a telegram called me to Berlin to an important conference. Here I looked at sketches, plans, and working drawings until my eyes swam. 4 more months passed which I utilized to the full. I then went to Kiel and saw a remarkable framework of steel slowly take shape upon the stocks across the way at Gardend. Rotund, snug, and harmless, the thing lay there. Inside it were hidden all the countless, complicated, and powerful features of those sketches and working drawings. I cannot boast that the reality as executed in steel and brass was any easier to grasp than the endless network of lines and circles which had bewildered me when inspecting the blueprints. Those of you who have seen illustrations and photographs of the interior of the central station or the turret of a submarine will understand what I mean. And should you have entered a submarine itself and felt yourself hopelessly confused by the bewildering chaos of wheels, vents, screws, cocks, pipes, conduits, above, below, and all about, and to speak of the mysterious levers and weird mechanisms, each of which has some important function to fulfill, you may find some consolation in the thought that my own brains performed a devil's dance at the sight. But after this monster, with its tangle of tubes and pipes, had been duly christened, and its huge gray-green body had slid majestically into the water, it suddenly became a ship. It swam in its element as though born to it, as though it had never known another. For the first time I trod the tiny deck and mounted the turret to the navigation platform. From here I glanced down and was surprised to see beneath me a long, slender craft, with gracious lines and dainty contours. Only the sides, where the green body vaulted massively above the water, gave an indication of the huge size of the hull. I felt pride and rapture as my eye took in this picture. The fabric swayed slightly beneath my feet, an impressive combination of power and delicacy. And now I know that what had at first seemed to me nothing more than the product of some mad fantasy on the part of the technicians was in reality a ship. It was a ship in which oceans might be crossed, a real ship to which the heart of an old sailor like myself might safely attach itself. Then came a short period of trial trips and diving tests, all of which were carried off successfully. And at last the day of departure arrived. As soon as the last escort had turned around, a final diving test was ordered. Instantly the response came back from the turret and the central station, and the men hurried to their posts. The oil engines were still hammering away at a mad rate. I left the manhole of the turret. The cover was battened down. The engines stopped at the same moment. We felt a slight pressure in our ears for a moment. We were cut off from outside, and silence reigned. But this silence was merely an illusion, and was due to the change. Upon the diving valves, submerge! The valves were flung open, and the compressed air escaped hissing from the tanks. At the same time a gigantic, intermittent snorting ensued, like the blowing and belching of some prehistoric monster. There was an uncomfortable pressure in our ears, then the noise became more regular, followed by a buzzing and a shrill hum. All the high notes of the engines in the central station intermingled, and made a bewildering noise. It was like a mad, diabolical sing-song. And yet it was almost like silence after the dull, heavy pounding of the oil motors, only more insistent and irritating. The penetrating hum in the various vents announced the fact that the diving mechanism was in operation. It moaned and sang lower and lower in the scale of tones. These slowly diminishing and steadily deepening tones give one the physical feeling of mighty volumes of water pouring in and flooding full. You have the sensation of growing heavier and sinking as the boat grows heavier and sinks, even though you may not be able to see through the turret window or the periscope how the bows are gradually submerged and the water climbs higher and higher up the turret until all things without are wrapped in the eerie twilight of the depths. The faithful lamps burned, however, and then a real silence suddenly ensued. There was no sound but the gentle trembling rhythm of the electric engines. I then gave the order, "Submerge to 20 meters." both engines half steam ahead. I was able to follow our submersion by means of the manometer. Through flooding the tanks, the boat is given several tons overweight and the enclosed ship space is made heavier than the displaced quantity of water. The Titanic fish, therefore, began to sink downward in its element. That is to say, it began, in a certain sense, to fall. At the same time, the electric engines are put into motion, and the propulsive force of the propellers acts upon the diving rudders and causes the sinking to become a gliding. After the required depth has been reached, something which may easily be read from the manometer that records the depth, all further sinking may be stopped by simply lightening the hull, which is done by forcing out some of the water in the submarine's tanks. The furious growling of the pump is always a sure sign that the required depth is being approached. The noise ceased. Only the electric motors continued to purr, and the word came from the central station, 20 meters, even keel. Rudder set. So we forged ahead at a depth of 20 meters. Of course, we are blind under such conditions and can regulate our movements only by means of the depth recorder and that precious little jewel of the boat, our compass. No ray of light reached us any longer from without. The periscope was submerged long ago, and the steel safety covers over the windows were closed. We had been metamorphosed completely into a fish. Orders were then given to rise again. The Deutschland carried out this maneuver with the same facility with which she had taken the initial dive of her long voyage. In record time the ballast tanks were emptied, and the change from electric motors to oil engines was completed without further loss of time. The boat was started at top surface speed towards her ultimate goal, the United States. On the following day the Deutschland barely escaped running foul of a British submarine chaser, disguised as a neutral merchantman. A quick dive alone saved her. When she came up again a wild storm and a heavy sea were raging. Even before the change from the electric motors to the oil engines had been completed, another dangerous-looking vessel appeared and before long was recognized as a hostile destroyer by Captain Koenig. He tells us that he made one jump into the turret and slammed the cover fast. "Alarm! Dive quickly! Flood! Set diving rudder! 20 meters depth!" The commands were uttered in almost one breath, but the execution of them. To attempt to dive with such a sea running was sheer madness, as experience has taught us. What was I to do? The destroyer might have seen us already. Well, we knew we must get under, and as quickly as possible. The men in the central below me were working away in silent haste. All the exhausts were opened wide, the compressed air hissed from the tanks, the diving vents were chanting in all possible keys. I stood with my lips pressed together and stared out of the turret window upon the tossing sea, and watched for the first sign of our going down. But our deck remained still visible, and we were continually lifted into the air by some wave. There was not a moment to be lost. I ordered the diving rudder to be set still more sharply and both engines to drive ahead with full power. The whole vessel quivered and thrilled under the increased pressure of the engines and made several leaps. She staggered about in the furious seas, but still seemed loath to leave the surface. Then she gave a jerk and her bows suddenly dipped and cut into the flood. She began to sink into the depths at an ever-increasing angle. The coming daylight vanished from the windows of the turret. The manometer in rapid succession showed 2, 3, 6, 10 meters depth, but the angle of the boat also began to increase. We staggered about, leaned back, slipped off our feet. We then lost our footing entirely, for the floor of the Deutschland slanted sharply toward the front. I was just able to catch hold of the ocular or eyepiece of the periscope. Down in the central the men were hanging on to the hand wheels of the diving rudder. A few terrible seconds passed thus. We had not yet seized the full significance of this new situation when there came a severe shock. We were hurled to the floor, and everything that was not fastened down went flying in all directions. We found ourselves in the queerest attitudes, and stared into one another's faces. There was a grim silence for a moment, then First Officer Krapol remarked dryly, "Well, we seem to have arrived." This broke the ghastly tension. We were all rather pale around the gills, but at once tried to get our bearings. What had happened? What had caused this unnatural inclination of the boat, and why were the engines above us raving at intervals in a way that made the whole boat roar from stem to stern? Before any of us had arrived at any solution of the mystery, our chief engineer, little Cleese, had jumped up from his crouching position and, swift as lightning, had swept the engine signal dial around to "stop." And suddenly there was a deep silence. We slowly assembled our proper legs and arms and thought hard over what had happened. The vessel had slanted down toward the bows at an angle of about 36 degrees. She was standing, so to speak, on her head. Our bow was fast upon the bottom of the sea. Our stern was still oscillating up and down like a mighty pendulum. The manometer showed a depth of about 15 meters. However, the Deutschland finally worked herself free and soon was again on the surface. Luck must have been with her, for she had suffered no damage and, in spite of the mountains of water which she must have thrown up, the hostile destroyer had not discovered her. Once more she was off on her way. End of The Future of the Submarine, Part 1. Recording by William Tomko.